Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's session. On behalf of everyone at Rev.io, I'd like to thank you for joining us today. Before we begin our presentation, I would like to go over a few housekeeping items. First, audio will automatically come in through your computer speakers. However, if you're having trouble using your speakers or unhappy with the quality of the sound, you can also dial in via phone number and access code listed on the screen. A recorded version of this webinar will be emailed to you within 2 weeks. And lastly, feel free to ask questions during the presentation using the questions box in the GoToWebinar control panel. We will have a live Q&A at the end of the event, but if any of your questions do not get addressed during today's event, we will follow up with you directly via email. For those of you just joining us, welcome. Today, Laura Abraham Mahoney and Jeff Siegal from Jabian Consulting will be discussing improving process to fuel growth, how automation can transform your team. Without further ado, I'd like to introduce our two speakers. Ms. Abraham Mahoney is a director with Jabian Consulting. She has 15 years of experience working with a broad range of clients and industries. Her passion and expertise is in operational excellence. She takes a process approach to business strategy and analysis, paired with project and change management skills to implement lasting results. In other words, making things better, making sure it gets done, and making change stick. Jeff Siegal is a manager with Jabian Consulting, where he specializes in process engineering and optimization. He works with clients across industries, including retail, automotive, and manufacturing, to improve their results with process-driven business and IT solutions. With the help of our two speakers from Jabian Consulting, we'll be covering 4 main objectives: learning how well-defined process can drive growth, best practices for being customer-centric when optimizing processes, right-sizing structure and processes for the size of your company, and lastly, the importance of automation and how to implement it. Let's get started. Lauren and Jeff, we are so glad to have you here with us today. Let's start out with the basics. Can you tell us what process excellence means? When you design or redesign your processes, what makes a strong process?
Sure, Olivia, and thanks again for having us today. So to get to your question, while it seems pretty basic, that can really be a pretty loaded question. But in its simplest form, process excellence just means that your process is effective, efficient, and it creates value. So one analogy I've heard to describe this is that a lot of people can relate to is doing yard work and cutting grass. So when we think about these 3 pillars, being effective relates to how well you're cutting the grass. Are you cutting all your grass blades evenly? Did you put enough gas in the mower to get you through the whole yard? And more importantly, did you miss any sections of grass? When you think about being efficient when you're mowing your yard, as you work through your cutting season, were you able to cut the same amount of grass faster? Were you able to cut more grass in the same amount of time? And then finally, creating value. So did I mow well enough that you can bring your kids outside and start playing t-ball without having to worry about knee-high weeds? And do you have that curb appeal for the Yard of the Month award? It may seem a little bit silly, but it's an easy way to describe those core tenets of a strong process. So let's dig a little bit deeper now. An effective process is really a process that gets the job done. You want it to be a robust process, meaning it continues to run without, external factors affecting it too much. And when we think about it, it boils down to what's called the 80-20 rule. This process should work in most all scenarios, therefore it limits variation. So when you are designing your robust process, you need to take into account multiple decision points and multiple variations, but know that 20% or so of your variations may not fit within the core process, and those will be handled outside through another process. A strong process is also repeatable and standardized. and it must be that way to be truly effective. And part of defining a repeatable and standardized process means documenting your process. That is a clear way to ensure everyone is clearly aware of the roles and responsibilities as a part of the process. And one thing that we see a lot is we document these processes either for our client or with our client, and they become shelfware. And that's obviously is not a great thing, and it's really a culture change for a lot of people. But you want to make sure that those process flows really become a living document that are updated over time, and you can go back and refer to them as needed. So being efficient, though, means achieving maximum productivity with minimum wasted effort or expense. And applying that to a process really means keeping things lean and mean. You've also probably heard of the acronym KISS, which stands for Keep It Simple. So when you're creating a process, you want to limit complexity so it's easy to follow. Getting back to what we said before, it's much easier to repeat a simple process than one that's really complex. Some examples of how to keep it simple means limiting waste or duplicated efforts or even unnecessary handoffs in an approval process. When we talk about waste, that really comes in the form of errors. So we want to error-proof our process as best we can. One thing that we'll probably all see when we're doing our Black Friday shopping is examples of error-proofing on websites which have drop-down menus instead of open text fields, or using a text mask that requires, when you're entering your phone number, it's looking for 10 digits instead of just an unlimited number. So, everything's not going to be that black and white, though, so you want to do some sort of risk assessment or contingency plan as you design your process if things aren't that black and white. The third element for a strong process is making sure that it's creating value. And in order to know that you're creating value, you need a way to measure and control your process. And so that's making sure that your customers, whether they're internal or external, help define those success targets. So then you keep track of those on a predetermined basis, making sure that you're delivering on those expected results. It also helps with ownership and accountability over time. And lastly, and probably most importantly, is making sure that your process is communicated. We can do all the steps above that we've talked about, but until we communicate that process, making sure it's understood by all, including internal and external stakeholders, what their roles and responsibilities are, and goals and outputs, your process may not be as effective as you'd like it to be. So that's also a great channel for feedback when you go back through refining your process in the future.
Efficient, effective, and creating value. Those are great points to think about when building processes. So can you tell us a little bit more about why process excellence is so important, and what value does it really bring to an organization?
Hey, Olivia, this is Lauren. As consultants, we help our clients with some of their most challenging problems. And regardless of what the specific problem is, what the industry or type of organization, we often see that process is at the root of those challenges. So process improvement can strategically help you solve any number of different types of problems. It can also help you sometimes just attain targets that you're not able to reach because your processes aren't optimized. We often see these challenges expressed in a couple different ways, right? So two different sides of the same coin. One is more symptom-focused. I'm having X, Y, or Z challenges. I'm seeing X, Y, and Z problems. I'm seeing declining metrics. The other side is more goal-focused, which is I want to attain X, Y, and Z targets. I want to get faster. I want to get cheaper. I want to get better. So when you think about process improvement and what values it brings to your organization, it does kind of boil down to those types of things, right? Faster, cheaper, better. Most often we think about cost reduction. If you streamline your process and you become more efficient, then you save time and therefore you save money. Automation is a great way to gain efficiencies and save money. And robotic process optimization, RPA, is actually a rising trend we see in operations today and in process improvement. A second key benefit of process excellence is increased speed or throughput. This is also a benefit of automation as well, but whether it's automated or not, any efficiency gains by improving your process is value to your organization. So in manufacturing, this could mean creating more widgets per hour, or back to Jeff's example of mowing the grass, right? Are you able to mow your grass in less time and then get out there and play t-ball with your kid? Or could you maybe do your grass in the front and the back, and before you were only able to do the front? You know, thinking about it, again, staying with that metaphor, you have grass-cutting companies. Those guys are not pushing standard mowers, right? They're doing ride-along mowers. They've automated the process. They've made it faster. That increases their throughput and their speed. A third benefit of process excellence is improved quality and compliance. So depending on the industry you're in, compliance can bear varying levels of risk. Highly regulated industries like finance or healthcare, compliance becomes a complex burden on the organization. However, it's necessary because they are regulated. It's unavoidable. It must be done. Other industries where quality maybe is less regulated, it's more a function of internal operational efficiencies or driving customer satisfaction, and therefore you need a certain level of quality for your outputs to be valuable. I was working with a technology company in the automotive industry that was in the midst of completing post-merger integration activities after a large acquisition. It became apparent that the company they were acquiring, their invoices were drastically incorrect and frequently late. So this issue became a real accounting problem because the parent company was publicly traded. So we worked with this client and helped them optimize their billing process, recommended automation actually in this case to make the improvements that we had identified, pull out some of the defects. And 4 months after project completion, all invoices were sent on time and invoice errors were virtually eliminated. So the client was able to collect revenues from their customers in an accurate and timely manner, which then had positive impacts on their statements for Wall Street. So you can see, here's a great example where both speed and quality become really critical to the success of a process, where process excellence is important not only for the end customer, but also the internal balance sheet of the company. And then lastly, I think another benefit is driving growth and scalability. So when your organization is small, you can rely on a few key people to smooth out issues or to dive into a problem and quickly solve it, because everybody's wearing so many different hats. But as your company grows, that's no longer feasible. And these so-called heroic efforts end up pulling resources away from top priorities that you need to get done in order to grow and leverage the scale. Those standard repeatable processes, consistently delivering at pace with your organization's growth, will help that growth and scalability and ensure that you have the results you're looking for.
That's great. And many of our clients are fast-growing companies looking to grow and scale. So what do you look for when creating a sustainable process to drive growth and scale your business?
Sure. And when we think about that question, it really boils back down to what we talked about making a strong process. And that's kind of the key to driving growth. Obviously more standardized and repeatable processes are easier to execute, and they're easier to manage too. Therefore, they are more scalable. So when you think about your growing business, maturing operations, and creating excellence to fuel growth, like Lauren mentioned, we really think about reducing the heroic efforts of the few and having more defined roles when we begin to grow, have more people in our organization, and doing more things. When everyone's wearing multiple hats, which is pretty common in smaller organizations, you're just doing what you can to get it done. But you might not really have time to stop and think about, are you doing things in the best way, the most efficient, effective, and value-driven way? In this scenario, we see a lack of process ownership, which can lead to that redundancy we've talked about, or even things getting forgotten, which neither yield consistent results. So ultimately, to drive growth, your processes really need to be lean and mean. I think Lauren mentioned the phrase doing more with less, and that can sometimes make people cringe, but it's really the way to unlock more out of your existing resources by minimizing what it takes to complete their process and removing waste. When you remove waste and focus on those things we've just talked about, that can really shift the focus to driving growth.
Okay, that's great. And can you go into more detail about what waste is and how a company could go about identifying and removing waste in a process?
The best way to define waste is to think about what it's not. Waste is anything that does not deliver value. So when you're reducing waste, you're removing the process steps that don't deliver value. So what's value? There's two types of value, customer value and business value. The first, customer value, is something that directly benefits the customer and that they're willing to pay for. Frequently, this would be new features or customization that maybe require additional processing or extra steps, but are value-added steps because the customer is willing to pay a premium for those things. So think about something like that we're going to see a lot this season, right? Tailgating tents. So you have a process for manufacturing these tents, and that's repeatable, it's consistent. But hey, I want my tent to have this logo on it. I want my tent to have this team name or these colors. Well, that requires extra process and a special process, but I'm going to pay that premium to get that done. Therefore, it's a customer value add and would be able to stay within your value stream. Second type of value is business value add. So these are activities that don't impact the customer but are required to produce the product, sometimes for legal or compliance reasons, sometimes just for operational necessity. So an example might be technology upgrades, right? So there's an effort there on the technology side to integrate or to upgrade, to do the development that's needed there. Customers don't really care what platform you're running on as long as it gets the end result that they're looking for. So that's an example of business value add, because although the customers aren't willing to pay for it, you can't make your product or deliver whatever it is that you're looking to deliver at the end of the process without it. So anything remaining that's not business value add or customer value add is considered non-value add or waste.
Okay, and when you're looking at a process, what are some tips or best practices for identifying the non-value add steps, or basically the waste?
Sure. One common acronym that we come back to a lot when identifying waste or seeing the sources of waste is downtime. And we'll walk through each of these and try to provide some examples here. So as you can see on the screen here, the D, we'll start at the top, D represents defects and rework. And those defects really cause the rework in the process. So anytime you can eliminate those type of things, it obviously helps you remove waste from your process. The O stands for overproduction. And we live in a world where more is better, but not necessarily when you're thinking about making your process lean and mean. So shifting that focus from a manufacturing standpoint from the just-in-case production to just-in-time production. The W stands for waiting time. And we can eliminate waste through automation of workflows, which can really help boost your process. The N denotes non-utilized talent. And an example that I think of here is just insufficient training. So when your company is growing, you want to make sure that you have those roles and responsibilities defined, and making sure that the people that are responsible for those roles have the necessary training to do their job right. The T stands for transportation, which is just those extra unnecessary steps in a process. The I represents inventory, which is similar to overproduction, but think of it as just excess inventory. The M stands for motion, which could be even just a poor work area layout. And then the E stands for extra processing, which could come in the form of excessive signatures for reporting. A recent client I had developed a monthly blue book for all their financial reports that included over 50 pages of custom reports. And when we came in and did an analysis for them and helped them with their ERP implementation, it became apparent that they didn't necessarily need all those 50-plus reports, that they could achieve their objectives, be able to measure their success based on a standard 10 reports. And they can obviously grow from that, but we want to make sure that we're reporting on the right things and not producing waste. So there are obviously a number of techniques that can help you to identify customer value add, business value add, and non-value add. Something like a SIPOC or a value stream map can help with that, and then you can refer back to this acronym to help you kind of identify sources of waste.
One example we see in our daily life that I think represents a good example of gaining efficiencies is banking. So a long time back, right, when you wanted to go to the bank, you had to wait for banking hours. You had to drive to your bank and then wait in line for the teller. When you finally made it up to the teller, then the teller sometimes had to run back and forth to the mysterious back room, maybe gaining approvals, maybe getting extra cash, a lot of handoffs, a lot of waiting, a lot of movement. Then that process started to become more streamlined and ultimately automated, and then we had ATMs, right? And this was a major innovation. It enabled scalability and cost savings for the banks who no longer had to employ as many tellers, and as customers, it certainly saved us a lot of time as well. So the ATM process was squeezed to be as efficient as it could be because everything was in one place. There wasn't much waiting, and they're ubiquitous all over the place, so even your transportation is minimized because you don't have to go as far to find your branch. But when you look at those value-added, those customer-facing processes, and even some of those business value processes that they did such a good job streamlining into an automated teller machine, there was still a piece of it that could be considered non-value-add, which is driving to the ATM. I don't do that because it's part of the financial process. I do it because I have to get there. So then that next innovation that most of us are today able to take advantage of, right, is removing that non-value-added waste. And we now have a mobile app, and we can do so many of those financial transactions right there on our phone without having to drive anywhere.
That's great. And I know oftentimes we hear about communications and IoT service providers looking to streamline their process for new orders and activating new lines of service. We hear several stories from clients before implementing Rev.io where they would actually swivel chair between a couple different portals, one where they'd enter a request for a new line of service, entering all the customer details and information. And then they'd have to do the same thing in a second platform where they manage their customers internally. We've been able to automate that double entry through provisioning to carriers and switches and integrating multiple platforms into one user interface for quoting new orders, managing customers, and calculating taxation and billing and payments. So
that is a great example, and you touched on a lot of different pieces of what we've already talked about with automation and waste reduction with that example. So yeah, that definitely rings true.
Perfect. And at the beginning of our session, you mentioned robotic process automation as a trend in the world of process excellence. Can you talk more about how automation and RPA can help drive process excellence, and what types of processes should people look to have automated through this strategy?
Sure. Let's first talk about defining what robotic process automation is, and that's really the use of a software robot that's going to automate those repetitive, routine tasks that don't require human strength, like reasoning and judgment. RPA is a form of automation, and it's really seen kind of as that next generation of automation. It's the difference between using automation for one step of the process, such as data entry, to using a bot to complete the whole process, which can sometimes, as we'll see in some examples, is really inclusive of complex logic. And it really incorporates that more robust logic that enables the bot to replace human decision-making. A recent example that I've encountered at my client is their use of RPA to apply funds to customer invoices in their shared service center. Their current situation is that they're going to see increased volume of transactions over the next 6 or 8 months before they'll finally kind of become steady state. And with their current team, they really only have two options. They either increase headcount or find some way to automate with RPA. I'm sure all of us are aware that onboarding and training can be a high cost and a lengthy process because, let's just face it, knowledge transfer isn't immediate. And so implementing RPA really looked like the better option for them. So they had a company come in, do a demo of their software for RPA, and in their analysis, they realized that their average time to apply funds to invoices would decrease by over 90%. A task that took the clerk over 2 minutes to complete was now accomplished in a matter of seconds by a robot. For this particular company, the costs to stand up RPA were really lower than full IT systems automation, which can sometimes take months or even longer to really implement. And like I said just now, the timeline was a lot quicker. So in the example that I described, their department is seeing positive ROI 5 months after the implementation. Now, from a leadership perspective, that's obviously great news because SLAs are met more consistently. Applying their funds to these invoices has a lot of downstream impacts, so they're happy to see these SLAs met more consistently. And also their operating cash flow sees a significant positive impact. And then you go back to the employee perspective, and those mundane, uninteresting tasks that they really didn't enjoy completing in the first place are now done for them. They can shift their focus to activities and tasks that are more interesting and that kind of require more brain function from them throughout the day. Another example that I've heard of for a successful RPA implementation is from a retail products company. It's pretty similar to the example that you gave, Olivia, where you're doing a lot of swivel chairing. This particular accounting department had 5 accountants just focused on posting journal entries. Sometimes over 100 journal entries touching multiple countries throughout the day. And so in order to do this, similar to your example, they had to open up Excel, they had to open up their ERP system, probably a couple windows of that, their SharePoint site, and their shared drive. So you're talking about, prime areas for inaccurate data entry. But when they looked at their RPA solution, they programmed a set of robots to open up their templates from their shared folder, validate the request using if-then commands, and then they uploaded the journal voucher to their ERP system, which created the journal entry and finished the process for them. And their cost savings were huge. The accounting team was actually able to see a 60% reduction, so they were able to reallocate 3 of those resources to other tasks, and they didn't sacrifice controls or quality. Their accuracy rate, similar to my first example, increased to almost 100%. And for those employees, it's certainly reduced their manual repetitive task load, which they obviously see as a benefit. Now they focused on exception processing and give their focus and energy towards solving issues that really need that human intervention. Now, those employees have also been able to get more involved in value-added activities outside of those core transactional processes, which helps with month-end analysis and doing reporting that focuses more forward-thinking decision-making instead of reactive decision-making. So we see in our examples here that there are some key characteristics of processes that can and should be automated. And those are typically repetitive and time-intensive processes that will decrease employee productivity and also have well-defined, repeatable steps. The process should also be rule-based, not requiring human judgment. So really, when we think about it, RPA makes sense when you're designing or redesigning a system is too costly. When the cost of human resources, onboarding and training and knowledge transfer is higher than the cost to implement RPA. Or when it's just the process is fairly repetitive and can be laid out in a linear flow. Before we get into any RPA solution, we should really make sure that it aligns with our goals and outcomes that the process is trying to achieve, really the strategy behind it. If the process isn't adding value, instead of trying to automate it, go back and figure out if there's a way to remove it altogether or remove waste to make it more valuable. Then look at the process to determine whether it's something that can be repeated and broken down into those logical, repetitive components. And if so, it's likely a candidate for automation.
That's great. It sounds like there's a lot that we can do with RPA. How do you ensure efficiencies don't negatively impact the customer experience? Because that's something that we're really focused on, and I'm sure a lot of our audience is as well.
Yeah, that's a great question, because a lot of times the pressure to gain efficiency is so great and often is very focused on cost that we forget about the customer impacts. Or as we're trying to streamline processes, maybe on the back end, it ends up adding complexity or extra steps for the customer. So it's definitely important to keep the customer in mind with any process improvement project to ensure at a minimum no negative impact, and hopefully you'll also gain benefits for the customer as well. So here's a couple of different strategies that you can use to ensure you keep customer in mind. So the first is to integrate customer value into the definition and analysis of your process. When you're mapping the as-is and to-be processes, see where the process fits within your customer lifecycle or your customer journey. This can help identify the customer's needs and maybe even draw new conclusions about what is value added within your process. Keep in mind what are those key customer touch points and where in the process has the most significant impact on customer experience. Because ultimately, not all customer touch points are created equal. So a good example of that is when grocery stores were looking at improving customer experience and they were thinking about self-checkout. It was a really big deal because the final taste you have of your shopping experience is that checkout process. And it is significant in how your customer thinks about their entire experience, even though there's so many more elements to what that experience entails. So waiting in line is a very slow and tedious and annoying part of shopping that they eliminated by adding self-checkout and helping people get through faster. Just a way of thinking about your process and your touch points and thinking about which ones drive the biggest customer experience, making sure all of that is included in your as-is or to-be definition. Another strategy is engaging internal customer advocates to help you incorporate that external perspective. So just like for personal decisions where we would engage our family and our friends, the same thing is true here. There might be teams or individuals who really know the customer perspective, and involving them in the analysis can just help drive that awareness of the customer experience. That way you don't sacrifice any of the customer experience as you're making improvements or making cuts of certain steps or stages within the process to drive a more efficient, effective, and value-driven process. The external perspective will also help prioritize the future state roadmap that you build out and help identify quick wins that are maybe minor and easy to implement but can significantly improve your customer experience. So again, with the prioritization, driving the customer at the top of that list. Another way is to include customer data supporting your process improvement priorities. So prioritization not just from the customer experience perspective, but also being data-driven when you do that. So customer data points when you're setting those goals that help you prioritize. Not all processes are going to be one size fits all. And so you want to make sure you're also thinking about which customers are most valuable to you and looking at the data to support which steps and stages of your process, which pieces can come out that won't sacrifice the customer data that you have. Lastly, customer value metrics and customer-centric success criteria are important to define. So think about how you measure operational goals from the customer perspective. Will the future state process add or reduce complexity? Will this process directly even impact the customer at all? Will process improvement change the customer in one channel or across all channels? How well will this process improvement initiative scale or be replicated across the organization when you have customers in different segments or markets? Looking at metrics and benchmarks like your customer effect score or the net promoter score, whichever metrics align best to your organization and project goals, determining those up front and factoring those in to help you make decisions and prioritize. So continue to put the customer first, making that a part of your process improvement goals, and then that will help you to pursue the efficient, effective, and value-driven without forgetting your customer.
That's great, and I know it's super important to make sure that you're, measuring customer success and using tools like the Customer Effect Score and Net Promoter Score are really effective ways of doing this. How do you implement process without being slowed down by too much structure?
Yeah, that's a really common thing we hear, and I've listed some of these misconceptions that we hear from our clients and colleagues even when we think about this implementing process. And so I just want to walk through these. The first is defining a process will slow me down. There are concerns about too much time being invested to define or stand up your processes, and that perception is really especially prevalent in high growth environments where you're really focused on building or expanding your products and services. And some traditional process improvement methodologies can be seen as cumbersome, which require that significant analysis and time away from your daily priorities, which is really trying to get more out the door. And that perception is that they'll slow down growth. But in reality, your key leading concepts that we've kind of walked through today, eliminating waste, identifying value, and focusing on the customer will help provide a path to eliminate inefficiencies, which will help enable growth. In addition, taking the time to document the processes like we talked about and create standards really encourages an organization to take a step back and figure out why a process worked and how to repeat that success going forward. The next one that we hear is, a standard process won't work for me. I'm unique. And similar, that we hear that process just won't work for an organization because they are too unique. But in the beginning, most aspects of the business are handled as if they were unique, but in reality, it doesn't take a significant amount of time for some consistent processes to emerge. Your product lifecycle may be unique, but onboarding customers or customer service activities in general are going to be fairly consistent in a shorter amount of time. So by identifying those tasks early and establishing kind of those core processes, that can help alleviate some of the early confusion and also condition the culture of your organization to focus on efficiently enabling growth. More time can be spent on doing what makes an organization truly stand out and be unique, and less time on those repeatable operational tasks that you have to do. And then the last misconception here is process structure will kill my innovative culture. Again, we hear this from our startups or companies that have startup-like culture. And if we were going to mention process to that person, their reaction may be that of someone heading off to get a root canal. But defining process doesn't have to be agonizing. It can be a team-based event. The key is to emphasize what the necessary activities are without straying into too much detail and rigor that won't add value.
Great. Thank you so much for your insight, Lauren and Jeff. Now we have about 15 to 20 minutes to address some questions from our audience. So if you haven't had a chance to submit your question through the GoToWebinar questions box, we would encourage you to go ahead and ask any questions that you have so we can address these live today. The first question we have is, where are some of the key areas in an organization that you find the most value for automation?
I'll take that one, Lauren. Really, if we go back to when we were talking about our examples, those represent kind of opportunities where you've got high volume transactional processes that really require little human decision making, whether it's applying those invoices or applying payments to invoices or creating journal entries. Processing groups like procure to pay or order to cash are really ripe for those cost reductions when you implement some sort of automation. When we think of core controllership functions like journal entry and reconciliation, that's kind of another opportunity to look for great areas for automation. Usually the highest, the impact is positive for cost savings, speed, and accuracy. So it's a great area for improvement through automation.
And you were talking a lot about kind of the benefits of automation. How does it impact employees, and how do you, reduce the fear of maybe job security for those that are looking to, implement an RPA or any type of automation?
I think that's a great question. We have to be sensitive to the people, process, and technology whenever we're doing process improvement. At the end of the day, we actually find that the employees see the benefit significantly because they're able to reduce the amount of time they spend on repetitive manual tasks that are usually a little bit less interesting than the human decision-making, exception processing, more challenging type processes. Change management is also important, and anytime you make a change, whether it's automating something or even if you're just changing the process as part of optimization, you have to make sure you bring people along with you. So the change management element is making sure people understand what's in it for them and helping them to see their own perspective and their own benefits in the change. So employees who are able to maybe focus on more interesting tasks where there's perhaps more personal or professional growth, maybe there's time they're able to spend towards solving issues that need the human interaction, which is more value added than the repetitive, more mundane tasks that are often automated. And that can elevate their job and help them feel more meaningful within the organization. I think the key thing is helping them see the with them, right? The what's in it for me, doing the change management, pulling them along with the change, and tying the changes to their job to the meaningful outcomes and targets that you're achieving with the automation, so they feel like they're a part of the change.
That's great. I think having that buy-in at the beginning probably definitely helps with implementing the change and getting employees to rally behind it. How long would you say it takes to implement an RPA?
That's obviously the answer is a common consulting answer that it varies. It just depends on the kind of the scope. If you're really doing a lot through your RPA solution, it can take a little bit. I still haven't named a timeline yet on purpose because it really just does depend. But what we see a lot is that getting RPA stood up is significantly faster than any other sort of IT systems implementation, which is really why a lot of people are going this route when they think of automation and trying to make their processes more efficient, make their employees more efficient, and really get the most value out of their process.
A few things to take into account when you are considering how long it will take would be the complexity of the process and the decision-making that's involved. So how much logic is really involved that needs to be coded and quantified. Also, how many processes are involved and how many different systems are going to be included to integrate, right? All of these different components drive that complexity. So just right, it really does depend. But you'll also know where your starting place is. Are you currently defined and well documented, or are you starting from kind of trying to gain those requirements from what he said, she said, and what he's doing, what she's doing, starting with job shadow to start with an as-is state definition. So that will also vary your timeline.
That's a good point, Lauren. I mean, it boils back down to making sure that you have a documented process to begin with. That's really going to help identify areas that you can automate. Without that, I think you may just be wasting some time. So I think I'd start with documenting first.
Great. And I think one of our last questions here is, what are some of the risks, particularly for a smaller, fast-growing business, of not implementing strong processes?
Yeah, that's a good question, right? Because as Jeff mentioned at the end, we sometimes do feel a lot of pushback. So I think the risk is that when you feel like you're running as fast as you can run, you're a small company, you've got, I'll go back to the heroic efforts, right? You're wearing multiple hats, you're bopping every gopher in the bop-a-mole, like at the arcade, right? They just keep cropping up. That is not the best way to use your time. And so sometimes you end up being less efficient, so it takes you more time to do something. You aren't as effective, so you're not really getting things done as good as you could if you had a better process, better definition. Or maybe you're not getting the value out of what you're doing. So perhaps your customers aren't as satisfied as they could be, or your end product isn't quite as good as it could be. Maybe it's good enough, but if you were to put a little time into optimizing your process and driving better process excellence, maybe it could be that much better. I mean, I think it really is just sort of the unraveling and the reverse of the things that we've talked about, those core tenets of efficient, effective, and process-driven, or excuse me, and value-driven.
Great. Well, that wraps up all of our time today. Thank you again, Lauren and Jeff, for putting together this content and sharing part of your Wednesday with us. I know I found that very informative, and I'm sure our audience did too. And for our audience, thank you for joining as well, and we will see you next time.
Thanks, Olivia. Thanks, everyone, for listening. Have a great day.